Okay, a couple of questions I get often are, what can I do with old paint that I've taken off my palette? In another video, I removed some paint when I was cleaning, that was underneath, that had was still viable. I had poked the skin and gotten the stuff out from underneath, and it's still good. However, when I moved it to a new clean palette, one thing I noticed, it was slightly tacky. In fact, this one, now that I moved it, just in a day, this one's already started to finish setting up. So if you touch them and you move them and they're kind of sticky and tacky, they're already in the process, the chemical process of finishing, they're drying. So even though it was good for a long time, now this one is still good, but it is more sticky feeling than it would be if it were fresh out of the tube. I might not necessarily want to use that. It might not be a color I need a ton of, or let's say I've gotten some weird stuff left over. Let's see, same thing. Okay, so I've got green here. If I mix the green and the red, I know they're going to neutralize each other a bit. Turn to more of a brown. Okay, so when you ask yourself, well, what can I do with this junk paint? Paint that's left over at the end of a painting session, paint you pulled out from underneath other piles that had been sitting on the palette for a while. Okay, so what I've done is, because I didn't have a ton of it left over, but I did have some, I put out some other paint over here to the side, and that's just some yellow ochre and some titanium white. And the reason I did that is because titanium white covers really well, and yellow ochre is fairly inexpensive. So both those make it a good candidate to do this. And then the other thing I have here is a painting that I don't feel invested in this painting. Not a real fan. I'm ready to move on to something different. I just don't want to go back into it. And although painting over stuff is not necessarily the best practice, there are plenty of artists who have done it. And one reason that this one is not a terrible candidate to do that with is I've still got some raw areas of canvas under here, and there's not a ton of paint buildup on this. You can see some bits of medium that, have a little bit more linseed oil than the rest of the paint. You see those shiny bits where when I rotate it, it reflects off of it. What I'm going to do with this, just to make it even more likely to take the paint better, what I'm going to do is, using my knife, I'm looking to see if there are any bits that sort of butt out. Like right here is one butt. I'm just taking my knife and running it directly against the surface to scrape and knock down any spots that really stick up. And if you ask, well, does that actually work? You'll see there are little tiny flecks here. You see the bit that I pull off there with my knife, okay? And one reason you want to do that too is because if you have texture that's underneath that fights with whatever you're going to put on top, you might end up with that texture in a spot where it doesn't make any sense, especially if you're not a super textural painter. So that's the reason that I really kind of want to knock those areas down. I don't want to be fighting that later, okay? So again, depending on how thorough you want to be. So I'm scraping off any little bits that are left. Next thing I'm going to do, I've got a brush that's fairly large, and I'm going to take a large bit of this white actually, and I'll pretty much all the ochre, and I'm just going to mix these together, give me sort of a nice, okay, and then I'm going to take the leftover stuff, okay, so I've got this nice fleshy tone. The biggest purpose in doing this, and now some artists even use the leftover sediment that collects in the bottom of their solvent jars when they clean their brushes. They'll use that gray mud tone stuff to tone new canvases. That's one thing you can do if you want to. Biggest thing is I don't want to disrupt the principle of fat over lean. And what that means is that in terms of like how much solvent I use over this, I wouldn't want to go super thin with the solvent. I'm gonna have to go kind of heavy with the oil. So to do that, I'm gonna only minimally dip my brush into the solvent. And I'd like to mention too that I've got windows open here in the studio. So anytime you're working with solvents, make sure that you have somewhere that you're working in a well-ventilated space, because you don't want to be breathing those fumes in. Just because something's odorless doesn't mean you're not breathing in the vapors. You still are. You might just find later you've gotten a headache and you don't know why. Okay, so I'm putting my brush into the solvent, and that's just to condition the bristles, to kind of get them ready. Okay. This is sort of like people who like to put water on their toothbrush before you put the toothpaste on there. I know you're out there. So anyway, so I've dipped it into the solvent, and then I'm going to actually just wipe it a little bit. Okay, so now it's ready. Okay, now I've dried it quite a bit. This is the equivalent of taking a kitchen wash rag, wetting it in the water, and then wringing it out. So that's essentially what I've done with my brush. And you can see I'm closing up my solvent again. And the reason for that, like I said, is I want to paint for a lifetime. I want you to paint for a lifetime. So, okay, and I've got my canvas, and I'm just going to take my paint, and you can see it's very stiff, thick. And I'm going to take it and scrub it onto my canvas. Okay, so it's not completely obliterating, you know, everything that's on here. I have to go a bit more heavy. There we go. That starts to knock it down. And this pink actually will make a great foundation for a landscape painting. So, but you can see I do have to go a bit heavier to get it to cover. And again, it's the white that's really going to do the work in covering this. And now I'm using a really nice white. You might notice I used a less expensive yellow ochre. This one's more an student grade yellow ochre. This one is an artist quality white. This one's a brand called Williamsburg. It's been one of my favorites for more than 20 years. I love their paints. But you know, painting, don't worry about necessarily having the most expensive thing. One of the first things I did when I was a kid was take raw materials from outside, like leaves, and crush them up and made my own version of oil paint. I added them to vegetable oil from the kitchen and then painted it onto some paper to see what would happen. So, you know, don't feel limited, you know, by what you do or don't have, okay? The important thing is just getting into it and making something. Okay, so, and again, you know, if you, this may actually seem like too much work. This may seem like, okay, well, I'm really kind of wasting my material in doing this, because it's kind of a cost-benefit ratio here. You have to decide, really, this is taking me more in oil paint. You know, canvases these days, the surfaces that we can buy are a lot less expensive. So you might decide, this really isn't worth it for me. I don't really want to, but if you're someone who feels like, well, I just can't throw away that painting I started, this is one way to get around that feeling, is cover it, okay? And I did this when I was a student too, because, you know, I mean, didn't have a ton of money, wanted to use what I had, so definitely I painted over some stuff. You want to make sure you're using the same materials. So this is oil underneath. I'm going on top of it with oil. If it had been an acrylic painting, I could still go on top of it with oil. I would want to maybe rough the surface just a tiny bit, make sure it's got tooth, and again, to make sure it's going to be a smooth surface that I want to work with. So if I wanted to be really thrifty, I could push this paint around really hard, so that I'm not using up so much. But the one thing I've found is that if you have these different values showing through underneath, a lot of times that tends to distract people. So better bet is to cover this as uniformly as you can, at least enough so that you're not seeing some sort of image underneath, because otherwise you're going to end up being affected by that. So, and you can use any kind of brush to cover a canvas like this. I'm using one that's kind of expensive, but I could just as easily use a chip brush from Home Depot for this particular process. Just grab this one because it was handy. Also happens to be one of my favorites. So again, as materials continue to increase in cost, you know, you found ways to work around. That's what it means to be creative. Don't just settle for, I can't do something because I don't have what I need. Instead, ask yourself, well, how can I work with what I have? And one of the main reasons for me for covering an old painting is because when I have something that's incomplete, and if too many of those build up in the studio, then I end up in a position of, well, I have all these things that are unfinished, right? So by painting over this and creating just a colored ground to work on top of, suddenly it's going to become something new and exciting, and it's going to make me more excited to come back and work in the studio. So hope this helps.